The 17th century was witness to a rather shocking historical intellectual paradox. On the one hand, the early modern witch trials were reaching their terrifying crescendo, and on the other, philosophical modernity was emerging with Cartesian rationalism and Baconian empiricism. It's very possible that the very same people that first read Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, from the pen of Rene Descartes, could also smell the acrid aroma of a nearby incinerated body, or the metronomic swaying of those dangling from the gibbets convicted of criminal witchcraft. Thus, for a very few brief years, the witch and the rationalist were both a hunted species. But what did these early modern philosophers make of the question of witches and witchcraft, of demonology? Unsurprisingly, given the witch craze around them, virtually all philosophers of this period did in fact weigh in on just that question. So let's explore how the philosophers that gave us intellectual and scientific modernity understood witchcraft, demonology, and the massed execution of alleged witches unfolding all around them. Make sure to subscribe here for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support this work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this channel,
Yeah,
I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon, where you could support us there, or some of the cool merch we have available. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to get a reliable lay of the land for this kind of information, make sure to check out my study guide. And if you're interested in historical
this guy's
books,
channel,
actual
it is weird
historical
though. I
relics
guess
on
it's
topics
just
in the occult and the mystical,
tropes or tropes on both sides. You know, racist fucking Anglo-Saxon frat boys are a real thing.
In the description and in
And
the
so are guys
below.
that blame everything
Now,
on
let's turn to the relationship of philosophical
No, like,
modernity.
it's all, this guy really is. Like, you can just tell in everything he
Dr.
says,
Justin
and every
Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica,
Christian,
where we explore
heterosexual
the
Western men are Satan, dude. Like, Satan. Like,
and religion.
an exception. You know, beyond evil, beyond fucking Genghis Khan, beyond, like, really, dude? Like, and yeah, everyone else is innocent. Everybody is innocent, except white Western men. It's a weird thing, but it's true. That woke mind virus, that you can tell some of those guys really do have it, dude.
Before turning to the
Where, like,
philosophers,
he
let's be
thinks you're the
clear about
fucking
what we mean
devil,
by the
and
so-called
everyone else
witches in
is
question for
perfectly
this
fine.
episode.
The
The witch
Aztecs
that
were
was the
just,
target of the
you
early
know,
modern
that's
witch
just
trials was a very
no,
specific
dude.
legal,
Like, open
theological entity
cannibalism.
that took centuries to
It's a
develop by
weird
demonologists.
thing. And that is,
Now, while
it's the
magic
woke
had
mind
long been a
virus that
sin by
somehow
biblical
Western
law, it was only in the late
culture,
14th
Western
and 15th
heterosexual
centuries
Christian
that it
culture is
increasingly was
uniquely
transformed into a
evil.
heresy.
Knowing
Not
that's
just a
what they
sin,
teach. And
a
you're like, what?
heresy,
How
by
are you?
inquisitors like Nicholas Emmerich and Johannes
But you can tell
Nider,
this guy,
before
and I
being
like him
fully
halfway, and I try to
elaborated
listen to
most
him, but it just
infamously
comes
in
seeping
texts such
out
as
in
The
him.
Hammer
Like,
of Witches
fuck,
or The
dude, you
Magus
really believe
Maleficarum,
that?
published by that very
You believe
demented
white
inquisitor Heinrich
heterosexual
Kramer,
men are
Instigator, in
the root of all
1486.
evil
Now,
in the
I have
world?
done a ton of content,
But he does, you can tell.
hours worth of content, on the development of what scholars now call the elaborated theory of witchcraft, with full episodes
But
on
that's
all
that
those
comic
figures
book
that I
crowd.
just
I'm pretty
mentioned,
sure that's
along
what they
with the
talk
books
about in
that they
comic
wrote.
books, dude.
So you
Like,
may want
you
to check out
can't be
some
a
of those
normal.
if you just want to get a better understanding of the way in which people
Like, they
understood
hate you, bro.
witches
They
at
fucking
this
hate you.
time.
It's a
But by the
weird
late
thing.
15th century, the elaborated theory of witchcraft, as scholars typically understand it, had emerged. We now
Or you could
understand this as a
argue
kind
they
of
base
European-wide
their
and really
community on
worldwide
hating you.
conspiracy theory developed in the
That's so
minds
it
of
becomes, that's
inquisitors,
what their
jurists,
community is
theologians,
based
and
upon,
philosophers
is
of the
you being
late
the bad
medieval and
guy,
early
you
modern
being the
period
oppressor,
that
you being
held, here we
so
go,
yeah, it's
a
literally part of
new
their identity, dude.
woman-led heretical
So
sorcery sect had appeared in Europe, marked by entering into a pact or covenant with the devil, and thus officially apostasy from Christianity. This would typically involve sexual relations with the devil and demons,
so
along
just
with
like this, he's
incest,
talking about white
aerial
guys
flight for the
burning
purposes of
witches, but
attending
he
or
would
an
never say
assembly
anything bad
known as
about
a
Jews
sabbat or
fucking stoning
synagogue,
women to death.
which was presided over by Satan himself, in which
dude,
initiates
is
entered
that,
into said pact or covenant, usually by signing their
yep.
name in a book
No,
with
there's
blood,
nothing.
followed again by incestuous and promiscuous
Everything's
sex, the
excusable
general practice of
except
maleficent magic, the slaughter
what
of fetuses
Western
and babies,
Christian males
sometimes
do.
to make things
Everything
like
else
flying
can be
potions,
easily
and
excusable and
various other means for
understandable
preventing human
in a
beings from
historical,
procreating, like making
except
dudes' penises disappear, whose aim was
that's
to
uniquely
undermine
evil.
all of
No,
Christendom
and then you
as a
wonder why
part of the
these
devil's
white boys are
ongoing
ready
war with
to
God.
turn on
In
their own
fact, by the
people.
mid-15th century, this whole
The
theory, as
Apocalypse
much as
Now
it was
shit,
one
that
to run
Brown, that
positively
Charles Manson.
apocalyptic
Now you know
dimensions,
why
but
Charles
arguing that
Manson
the
was
new
willing
witch
to
heresy
start a
was
race
the very
war.
final attempt on the part of Satan
And he
to
didn't think the white
forestall
people
his
were going to win.
impending doom
That was the
by
whole
sending
point,
all
dude.
of
He
human
thought the
beings
white
on a
people were
kind
going
of spiral in sin and crime
and then they
as
were
a
going to come
final
up out of the
outrage against
hole and
God.
lead the planet of
Now,
the
to
apes.
be very clear about this, there is
Fuck, bro.
virtually no evidence
Yeah.
that these witches, as described
So
by this
anyways,
theological, juridical conspiracy theory, ever existed at all, thus making the nightmare of these
and you believe
trials
that made
all the
they
more
believe that made them the
horrible.
good guys
Ultimately, the
somehow?
trials were
Weird.
Christians killing other Christians, and among the most vulnerable Christians in society. The single greatest predictor for being executed as a witch in this period was simply being a poor, unmarried, elderly woman, often suffering from dementia or some other mental illness. And this point did not go unnoticed, by the way, by at least some of the people at that time, and skepticism about the existence of these witches and their heresy cult and the validity of confessions are often arrived at through manipulation and straight up torture, along with the mass execution for these crimes, was also met with published skepticism by at least some philosophers, jurists, theologians, and even some inquisitors. Even some inquisitors looked at all this and said, this is insane. And we're going to look at the range of reasons why many philosophers, and again, priests and inquisitors, thought something very wrong was going on. Interestingly enough, some of the earliest sustained criticism of the witch trials comes from the world of the occult philosophy itself. And while it's been greatly overstated, Cornelius Agrippa, the author of the famed 3 books of occult philosophy, did seem to have a complex relationship to the question of witches and witchcraft. On the one hand, he clearly held throughout his career that witches did in fact exist, they did make pacts with the devil and with demons, and they should be rightly punished for it. There's just no real denying that if you read what Agrippa says. And this is a consistently held position throughout his entire career as we have it. However, Agrippa is also equally famous for his defense of an accused witch at Metz in 1519, where he acted as legal advisor to the local magistrate there. In this case, the woman in question, we don't know her name like most of the women who were murdered, was imprisoned, tortured, and deprived of even food and water on the flimsiest of evidence imaginable, even exculpatory evidence and forged evidence. Agrippa himself argued to the local judge that the inquisitor, Nicolas Savin, was driven himself by personal animosity, cruelty, and was moreover corrupt, bribing criminals to testify against this poor woman. Further, the inquisitor relied on the worst arguments of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a text that was always under some degree of theological and legal scrutiny, and it was even eventually banned for use by the Catholic Church in 1600. This had basically violated her legal procedural rights, and further even committed heresy. The inquisitor was committing heresy by arguing that the woman in question was a witch, because, at least in part, her mother had been executed as a witch. Agrippa countered on both procedural and theological grounds, especially arguing that the sins of that sort aren't inherited from her mother. Her being baptized as a child would have exorcised any demonic power over her, and while we have Agrippa's brief to the judge, we don't know what the exact outcome of this trial was. Within a year of Agrippa having left that post, we do know that that inquisitor, Savin, was back at witch hunting, and we don't know the fate of the poor woman that Agrippa defended. Although some texts do say that she was acquitted, I think the jury's out about what really happened. But Agrippa's interjection in this case is interesting, given that we have a philosopher deeply associated with occultism, hermeticism, and Kabbalah, offering a relatively spirited defense of an accused witch, despite the fact that legally, defensor non admittor, a defense isn't permitted for such a witch, and those witch trials fact, if you defended a witch and she was convicted, you got the same punishment she did. So, and even more so that beyond simple defending her legal and procedural rights, he also injects a theological rebuttal of the inquisitorial demonologist precisely against the reasoning, as much as it is reasoning at all, of the Malleus Maleficarum. Having a convicted witch as a mother, even when convicting of having fornicated with the devil himself, does not a witch daughter make. It's even said that Agrippa composed a tract entitled Adversus Laniarum Inquisitore against the Inquisition of the witches, but if it did actually exist and were written by Agrippa, only basically a couple of quotations from it survive, and ironically enough, in the works of another inquisitor who converted from Judaism of all things. But as I mentioned, Agrippa's skepticism of the witch trials and of the existence of witchcraft has been greatly overstated. But his student, Johann Via, is rather exemplary in just that regard. In his De Praestigiis Daemonum, or On the Trickery of Demons, first published in 1563 but greatly expanded and reworked through his lifetime, he expressed theological and philosophical, but also medical doubt, medical critiques to the concept of witchcraft and its persecution. Via actually himself was a medical doctor, and he held to the relatively classic view of St. Augustine that demons, up to and including the devil, are only really capable of causing illusions and delusions. They can't actually manipulate the world without God intervening and letting them do that, and then they only have the power to invite such deception so long as people seek them out to be deceived. Via then points out the hypocrisy of the Inquisition and the witch hunts. Numerous books of demonic magic appear in print, with many learned men no doubt inviting such demonic interactions, and yet the victims of the witch hunts are overwhelmingly uneducated women. In fact, one of the books he's imagined is probably the so-called fourth book of occult philosophy, attributed to his teacher Agrippa. But he's examined some of these women in his medical practice, these women accused of witchcraft, and he's found that they all share a common quality. They're all suffering from what he calls melancholia. Now, he does in fact engage in the typical misogyny of the day by arguing that the weak physical and moral constitutions of women, such that they fall victim especially easily to this condition of melancholia. However, this just isn't the classical imbalance of the humorous version of melancholia, but for Via, a complex condition marked by an increased likelihood of delusions, confusing dreams with reality, fits of anger, memory loss, and even false memory, and generally what we might now call something like psychosis mixed with schizoaffective-like symptoms, such as command voices. These sections of De Praestigiis Daemonum detailing his analysis of melancholia are just so extraordinary that Via has been hailed as the father of psychiatry. In fact, on the merit of some of these sections, Sigmund Freud went on to say that De Praestigiis Daemonum was among the top 10 most important books ever published in the history of humanity. Now, I don't think I'd go that far, but this is a pretty landmark moment in the history of the development of how our mind might affect our body. Thus, this melancholic condition, especially among poor women and unlearned women, faced with theologically sophisticated inquisitors bent on confessions and having access to torture as a means of getting them, according to Weyer, largely created the very monstrous heresy
I passed the airport
they were
missions, bro.
attempting to eradicate.
I've never done that before. Yeah,
However,
I got
to
the
the
jetpack. Got
demonologists
the
of the time,
jetpack,
including
and the airport
King
becomes
James I of
you own
England,
it. Starts
Weier's denial of diabolism
there's the jetpack.
was evidence of his own diabolism.
How do I
and
take?
Weyer
Hey, how do I
was
take the jetpack off, Joseph?
mercilessly attacked by witch hunters like James I and Jean Baudin.
How do I
Now,
take the
to be clear,
jetpack
Weyer
off?
still very much believed in demons, but in the more typically
No, there's like a
Protestant,
button.
yeah, they're
There's
real
gotta
out
be a
there, but
button,
if you are a really good Christian, you don't have to really worry about them kind of way.
I
Unlike what he
remember
took to
hearing
be
about
Catholic
everyone loves the
superstitions
jetpack.
that
Yeah,
actually
well, because you can
inspired
get
demonic
everywhere with the
inspired
jetpack.
delusions. He thinks all the superstitious rituals of Catholicism are basically just tantamount to necromancy. Further, I'm also sure that he held that people,
Yeah, it's
including
pretty
women,
easy to
did
travel
in
with the
fact
jetpack.
make pacts with the devil under such deluded agendas. But people for him needed spiritual education and repentance, and the simple faith in Christ and not torture, confession, and execution. Now, I've made a whole episode going through De Prestigis by Johannes Weyer, including his attempt to actually mock those who summon demons,
Yeah, but
but then he
jetpacks
actually
is
ended up
definitely
being
ending.
the foundation for modern demonic
So
magic.
I'm getting there.
So that's ironic.
I think
But if
most
you're
people don't get the
interested in learning
jetpack.
more about Johannes Weyer, you can check out the episode that I've made
Well, yeah, you got to
about
finish all
him.
the flight
But
missions.
following on the logic developed by Weyer and responding to the jurist and demonologist Jean Baudin, whose 1580 The Demon Mania of the Sorcerers was in many ways the true
Yep, it's F.
successor to the
Good job,
Malleus
Joseph.
Maleficarum, the
It's F.
Englishman
Yep, good
Reginald
job.
Scott would
Thank you.
publish his monumental The Discovery of
That makes
Witchcraft
sense, like a
in
vehicle.
1584. And this absolutely wonderful text, if you can ever get a facsimile of it, or a real one, although they cost about 30 grand, it is just amazing. It's full of lurid woodcuts meant to expose the ridiculous nature of witchcraft beliefs of mostly inquisitors that held them. It deepens the analysis begun by Weyer.
Speaking
And
of, I
Scott
got
takes a
money.
fourfold critique of the trials. First, he takes a sociological analysis revealing how poverty, begging, and social ostracization of marginalized women, in fact, makes them the target of blame for all of community woes. Cow dies, poor woman. Crops fail, poor woman. So when something bad, you blame the poor begging lady, because clearly she's the devil. Further, he contrasts the sorcerers of the Bible to those of the demonologists, and he finds them basically incongruent. The Bible seems to be describing some group of people, the demonologist something else, and you can't justify persecuting the one on the basis of the other. In fact, he actually says that all of the powers attributed to these witches are just heretically salacious. And then he has a point-by-point takedown of the criminal elements of witchcraft enumerated by Jean Baudin, revealing them to be vacuous, legally redundant, or just both. And this section of the book, however, is just downright hilarious. Baudin's like, but witches poison people. And Scott's like, yeah, but that's just murder, isn't it? I mean, let them be hanged for their labor, Scott has. Lastly, Scott also brings to bear a litany of philosophical and proto-scientific arguments to detail just how the claims made by Jean Baudin and other demonologists about the marvelous feats of witches are just impossible. They just can't do all the things that the witches are said to be able to do, and believing that they do, by the way, is heretical.
Well, there's
Scott's
nowhere
The
to eat
Discovery
in
of
this town.
Witchcraft is a classic for good reasons, and I'm going to do a whole episode about it, frankly, because it's just that amazing. In it combines great philosophical, theological, and scientific argumentation with a heaping
Oh my
dose
God.
of
Fuck.
English sardonic wit. So,
Not the
well
whole
worth
thing,
coming
dude.
back to that, and well worth taking a look at it if you ever get the chance. But about a year later, Michel, what in the hell do I know, de Montaigne,
Dude,
would also weigh in on the trials around
it's starting.
1585.
Windows 11
Traveling through
just came
Germany,
out
he had
too.
occasion to read several
It's something.
confessions
It
and interview
seizes the
about a
whole fucking
dozen
screen.
alleged witches who were then on trial. And
I
while he
can't. I
confessed that
can't.
witchcraft might be real,
Hey,
he was
Buzz,
much more
come here.
convinced
See
that
if you
people
can
would lie
figure.
to themselves or others than
Maybe figure
simply
something out
accepting
here.
that these marvelous tales, such as the infamous flight to the witches' Sabbath, were true. Further, after contemplating his interaction with these alleged witches, he suggested that they should be given the herb hellebore, one for treating insanity, rather than hemlock, one for execution, thus expressing his classic witty skepticism of the whole murderous business
This
of the
won't
witch
close. Yeah.
trials. Francis Bacon, for
It's OBS. It's both of these. GTA won't close. OBS won't close. I just thought we were past not closing, dude. I thought we were past programs not closing, dude. This is fucking strange, dude. No, what year is it, dude? We're not past programs not being able to freeze up all your shit?